Picture this, it's September 22, 1862, and Abraham Lincoln sits alone in his office, holding a document that will reshape the soul of a nation. Outside, Washington swelters in the late summer heat. Inside, the President of the United States prepares to sign his name to the most radical executive action in American history. But this moment didn't begin today. This moment has been building for decades, for generations, through compromises that couldn't hold, through violence that couldn't be contained, through a moral crisis that finally erupted into the bloodiest war America has ever known. And you need to understand something right from the start. Lincoln didn't wake up one morning and decide to free the enslaved. The road to the Emancipation Proclamation is far more complex, far more political, and far more human than the legend suggests. This is the story of how a cautious lawyer from Illinois became the great emancipator, how a war to preserve the Union became a war for human freedom, and how one document, written in the careful language of military necessity, became the death certificate of slavery in America. But to understand that September day in 1862, we need to go back. We need to understand the man, the moment, and the impossible choices that led to the most consequential decision in American history. Abraham Lincoln did not arrive in Washington as an abolitionist. Let's be clear about that. When he took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, his single focus was preserving the Union. Slavery was the issue that had torn the country apart, yes, but Lincoln's public position was carefully calibrated. He opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. He called it a moral evil, but he also repeatedly promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. This wasn't political cowardice. This was Lincoln reading the room, understanding the fractured nation he'd inherited. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union, and their loyalty hung by a thread. Lincoln knew that any premature move against slavery would push them into Confederate arms, and so, in those early months of the war, he walked a razor's edge. When Union General John C. Fremont, commanding in Missouri, issued his own Emancipation Proclamation in August 1861, freeing the slaves of Confederate sympathizers in his district, Lincoln countermanded it immediately. When General David Hunter declared slaves free in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida in May 1862, Lincoln revoked that order too. To the growing chorus of abolitionists in the North, particularly the radical Republicans in Congress, Lincoln seemed maddeningly cautious, frustratingly slow. Frederick Douglass, the great orator and former slave, publicly questioned Lincoln's commitment to freedom. "The president is a man of limited vision," Douglass wrote. But here's what Lincoln understood that his critics didn't. He was playing a longer game, fighting a war on multiple fronts, political and military, and any misstep could lose everything. But something was shifting in Lincoln's mind during those first 18 months of war. The reality of what slavery meant, what it did to human beings, was becoming impossible to ignore. Thousands of enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines, seeking freedom, seeking protection. The Union Army didn't know what to do with them. Were they contraband of war? Were they free? Were they property to be returned? General Benjamin Butler coined the term contraband to describe them, a legal fiction that allowed the Army to confiscate valuable Confederate property, human property, without actually addressing the moral question. But these weren't property. These were mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, human beings who had risked everything for a chance at freedom. Lincoln met with some of them. He heard their stories, and something hardened in him, something clarified. Then there was the military reality. The Confederacy was using enslaved labor to support its war effort, building fortifications, growing food, freeing white men to fight. Every slave working for the Confederacy was a strategic asset for the rebellion. If Lincoln could strike at slavery, he could strike at the economic foundation of the Confederate war machine. It was a military argument for a moral action, and that distinction mattered to Lincoln. He needed constitutional justification. As president, he had no peacetime authority to abolish slavery, but as commander-in-chief during a rebellion, that was different. That was a war power. That gave him the legal ground he needed. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln had made his decision in private. He would issue an Emancipation Proclamation, but he kept it secret even from most of his cabinet. He needed the right moment, the right conditions. His advisors, particularly Secretary of State William Seward, convinced him that issuing such a proclamation while the Union was losing battles would look like an act of desperation, a last gasp from a failing government. Lincoln needed a victory. He needed to issue the proclamation from a position of strength, not weakness. So he waited. And while he waited, the war ground on. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 produced 23,000 casualties in 2 days. The Peninsula Campaign saw Robert E. Lee drive Union forces away from Richmond. The Second Battle of Bull Run was another Confederate victory. and then in September, Lee invaded Maryland, bringing the war to Union soil. Lincoln gave command to General George McClellan, a brilliant organizer but a cautious fighter, a man Lincoln once described as having the slows. And McClellan, for all his faults, had something Lee didn't: a copy of Lee's entire battle plan found wrapped around cigars in an abandoned Confederate camp. It was the intelligence windfall of the war. McClellan knew where Lee would be and when. On September 17, 1862, the two armies collided along Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and what followed was the single bloodiest day in American history. Antietam was carnage on a scale that still staggers the imagination. In the cornfield, men fought and died over the same few acres of ground, charging and countercharging until the corn was cut down by bullets as if harvested by scythes. At the sunken road, soon to be called Bloody Lane, Confederate troops held their position until Union forces flanked them and turned the lane into a trench filled with bodies. At Burnside's Bridge, Union forces threw themselves at a narrow stone crossing, dying by the hundreds trying to dislodge a few hundred Georgia sharpshooters. By the time the sun set on September 17th, there were 22,717 dead, wounded, or missing soldiers, more American casualties than D-Day, more than 9/11, more than any single day in the nation's history. Lee's invasion was stopped, but barely. McClellan had the forces to pursue, to destroy Lee's army completely. But he didn't. He let Lee retreat back across the Potomac into Virginia, and Lincoln, watching from Washington, was furious at the lost opportunity. But the battle, gruesome as it was enough. It was the victory Lincoln had been waiting for. Not a decisive victory, not a crushing victory, but a Union victory nonetheless. Lee had been turned back. The Confederacy's momentum was checked, and now Lincoln had his moment. 5 days after Antietam, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln called his cabinet together. They gathered in the White House, and Lincoln began the meeting in his typical fashion, reading them a humorous story from a book by Artemus Ward. His cabinet sat there, bemused and confused, until Lincoln put the book down and his expression changed completely. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have called you here upon very important business. I have, as you are aware, thought a great deal about the relation of this war to slavery." What followed was not a debate. Lincoln made that clear immediately. He had already decided. He was not asking for their approval. He was informing them of what he intended to do. He read them the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a document he had drafted months earlier and refined in secret. The proclamation declared that on January 1, 1863, 100 days from that moment, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion against the United States would be forever free. Not in the border states, not in areas already under Union control, just in the Confederacy. It was a military measure aimed at the heart of the rebellion. Some cabinet members were thrilled. Others were concerned about the political backlash, the effect on the border states, the constitutionality, but Lincoln was resolute. The document would be issued that day. And so it was. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation went public on September 22nd, and the reaction was immediate and divided. In the North, abolitionists celebrated, though some criticized the proclamation for not going far enough, for exempting the border states, for couching freedom in military language rather than moral imperative. Radical Republicans praised Lincoln but pushed for more. Meanwhile, many Northern Democrats were horrified. They had signed up to preserve the Union, not to fight a war for black freedom. Racism was rampant in the North, even among Union supporters. The idea of emancipation sparked fears of mass migration of freed slaves northward, of job competition, of social upheaval. In the South, the proclamation confirmed every Confederate fear about Lincoln and the Republicans. They saw it as proof that the North intended to destroy their entire way of life, that this was a war of subjugation and social revolution. Confederate President Jefferson Davis called it the most execrable measure in the history of guilty man. Internationally, the reaction was more favorable. Britain and France, which had been flirting with recognizing the Confederacy, now faced a moral calculation. How could they support a rebellion fighting to preserve slavery when the Union was fighting to end it? The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war's moral dimension in the eyes of the world. But Lincoln still had 100 days before the final proclamation would take effect. 100 days during which he could change his mind, during which political pressure could force his hand, during which the course of the war could shift everything. And the pressure came from every direction. Border state politicians begged him to reconsider, warning that he would lose their state's loyalty. Some of his own advisors suggested modifying the proclamation, limiting its scope. Northern Democrats hammered him in the midterm elections of November 1862, making significant gains and painting Lincoln as a radical extremist. Even some military officers, including McClellan, opposed the proclamation, seeing it as a political distraction from the mission of preserving the Union. Lincoln faced genuine doubts. He worried about whether the proclamation would survive legal challenges. He worried about whether it would cause more division than unity. He worried about whether he had the constitutional authority to do what he was planning to do. But he also knew this. Slavery was the root cause of the war, the poison that had infected the nation since its founding. The founders had made their compromise with slavery, had written it into the Constitution, had decided that unity mattered more than universal freedom. And that compromise had been a ticking bomb waiting to explode. It had exploded. The war was here. And if there was ever a moment to end slavery, this was it. As January 1, 1863 approached, Lincoln worked on the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation. He consulted with advisors. He refined the language. He wanted it to be legally unassailable, morally clear, and strategically effective. The final document was more sweeping than the preliminary version. It didn't just declare enslaved people free. It authorized the Union Army to accept black men as soldiers, a provision that would transform the war and bring nearly 200,000 black soldiers into Union ranks by war's end. It invoked military necessity but also called emancipation an act of justice. It was Lincoln trying to balance all the competing forces, all the different constituencies, all the various pressures while staying true to the core purpose, ending slavery where he had the power to do so. On the morning of January 1, 1863, Lincoln woke early. It was New Year's Day and the White House was hosting its annual reception. Lincoln would shake hands with hundreds of guests, a traditional presidential duty. But before that, he had one task to complete. The final Emancipation Proclamation sat on his desk, ready for his signature. Lincoln picked up his pen, then paused. His hand was trembling not from doubt but from fatigue. He had been shaking hands all morning. "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper," he said to those present. "But I have been receiving calls and shaking hands since 9 o'clock this morning, till my arm is stiff and numb. If my hand trembles when I sign the proclamation, all who examine the document hereafter will say, 'He hesitated.'" So he waited. He steadied his hand. And then, slowly and deliberately, Abraham Lincoln signed his full name, Abraham Lincoln, to the Emancipation Proclamation. No hesitation, no trembling, the deed was done. The immediate effect of the Emancipation Proclamation was both limited and profound. Limited because it only applied to areas not under Union control. Lincoln couldn't free slaves in the Confederacy by decree any more than Jefferson Davis could have legislated changes in the North. The proclamation's real power would come as Union armies advanced, as they liberated territory, as they brought Lincoln's words into reality. In the border states, slavery remained legal. In areas of the Confederacy already under Union control like New Orleans and parts of Virginia, slavery remained legal. But in the rebellious South, in the areas under Confederate control, the proclamation declared freedom. And as Union forces pushed deeper into the South over the next 2 years, they brought that freedom with them. Enslaved people didn't wait passively for liberation. They fled to Union lines by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, seeking the freedom Lincoln had proclaimed. They became soldiers, laborers, scouts, spies. They became agents of their own liberation. The Emancipation Proclamation gave them legal status, Union protection, and a stake in the war's outcome. This was no longer just a white man's war. This was a war in which black Americans had a profound and direct interest, and they fought for it with courage and determination that even skeptical white Northerners had to acknowledge. But here's what you need to understand about the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not the end of slavery, it was the beginning of the end. The proclamation was a war measure issued under Lincoln's authority as Commander-in-Chief. What would happen after the war? Could it be reversed? Could the Supreme Court strike it down? Could a future president revoke it? These questions haunted Lincoln. He knew that to truly end slavery, to bury it so deep it could never be resurrected, would require a constitutional amendment. And so, even as the war raged, even as Union and Confederate armies clashed at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, at Chattanooga and the Wilderness, Lincoln and the radical Republicans in Congress began working on what would become the 13th Amendment. It was a brutal political fight. It required Lincoln to use every ounce of his political skill, his ability to persuade, to bargain, to cajole, to pressure. He needed a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress and then ratification by 3/4 of the states. In January 1865, with the war still ongoing but the end in sight, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment by a razor-thin margin. Lincoln had personally lobbied wavering Democrats, had promised patronage positions, had made backroom deals. It wasn't pretty, democracy rarely is, but it worked. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Those words, ratified in December 1865 after Lincoln's assassination, finally ended slavery in America as a legal institution. Lincoln didn't live to see that ratification. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning and the nation mourned, but his legacy, his great work, was secure. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment had done what seemed impossible just 4 years earlier. They had ended slavery. They had redefined America's founding promise. All men are created equal was no longer a hollow phrase, no longer a promise deferred. It was, at least in law, a reality. Of course, legal freedom didn't mean true equality. The fight for civil rights, for voting rights, for social and economic justice would continue for another century and beyond. Reconstruction would fail. Jim Crow would rise. Segregation would endure. The promise of the Emancipation Proclamation would be betrayed again and again. But the principle, the legal foundation, the moral claim had been established. Slavery was dead, and that mattered. That changed everything. So why does the Emancipation Proclamation matter today? Why should you care about a document signed more than 160 years ago? Because it represents something fundamental about how change happens in America. Lincoln didn't free the enslaved because it was easy or popular or politically safe. He did it because the moment demanded it, because the war made it possible, because the moral arc of history, to borrow a phrase, bent toward justice, but only because people like Lincoln bent it. The Emancipation Proclamation was the product of political calculation and moral conviction, of military necessity and human compassion, of cautious pragmatism and radical vision. It was Lincoln at his best and most complex. Not a saint, not a simple hero, but a man navigating impossible choices and choosing ultimately to do the right thing. It reminds us that progress is messy, that justice is hard, that doing the right thing often requires courage, patience, and political skill. Lincoln waited for the right moment, built the right coalition, and struck when the iron was hot. He didn't act alone. He was pushed by abolitionists, by enslaved people fleeing to freedom, by black soldiers fighting for the Union, by radical Republicans in Congress. He was pushed by the terrible logic of the war itself, which made clear that the Union and slavery could not coexist. But he made the decision. He signed the document. He put his name to the proclamation, knowing it would define his presidency, knowing it would change the nation forever. The Emancipation Proclamation is also a reminder of the limits of individual action and the necessity of systemic change. Lincoln could issue the proclamation, but it took armies to enforce it. It took the 13th Amendment to make it permanent. It took decades of struggle to make freedom meaningful. One man, one document, one moment, they were essential, but they weren't sufficient. Real change requires sustained effort, requires building institutions, requires cultural transformation. And that work is never finished. The Emancipation Proclamation began the legal destruction of slavery, but the work of building a just, equal society continues today. When we talk about racial justice, about equality, about the unfinished business of Reconstruction, we're talking about the legacy of that September day in 1862 and that January day in 1863. We're talking about the promises made and the promises broken. We're talking about the gap between the ideal and the reality. And we're asking ourselves the same questions Lincoln asked. What does justice require? What does the moment demand? What are we willing to risk to do what's right? There's a story about Lincoln that captures something essential about the man and the moment. After signing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln reportedly said, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act." He was right, of course. Lincoln's name is synonymous with the Emancipation Proclamation. It is his defining achievement, the reason we remember him as one of America's greatest presidents. But here's the thing, Lincoln didn't know that in 1863. He couldn't see the future. He didn't know the war would end in Union victory. He didn't know slavery would be permanently abolished. He didn't know he would become a martyr, assassinated just as his great work was nearing completion. He acted on faith, on principle, on the belief that ending slavery was right even if it was difficult, even if it was controversial, even if it might fail. That's courage. That's leadership. And that's why we still talk about Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation more than a century and a half later. The story of the Emancipation Proclamation is not just about Lincoln, though. It's about the millions of enslaved people who lived and died in bondage, who resisted and survived, who seized their freedom when the opportunity came. It's about the black soldiers who fought for the Union, who proved their courage and their claim to citizenship on battlefields from Fort Wagner to Petersburg. It's about the abolitionists who spent decades demanding justice, who refused to compromise with evil, who pushed Lincoln and the nation toward emancipation. It's about the radical Republicans in Congress who fought for the 13th Amendment, who insisted that ending slavery was a moral imperative, not just a military tactic. It's about all the people, famous and forgotten, who made freedom possible. Lincoln signed the document, but freedom was a collective achievement, a product of struggle and sacrifice by countless individuals. We remember Lincoln because he held the pen. But we should also remember the people who made that moment necessary, who forced the issue, who refused to accept slavery's continuation. They are the true authors of freedom, and their legacy deserves our attention and our gratitude. As the Civil War raged through 1863 and 1864, the Emancipation Proclamation transformed the conflict in ways both subtle and profound. Union soldiers, many of whom had been ambivalent or even hostile to emancipation, began to see the freed slaves as allies, as resources, as human beings deserving of freedom. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to matter. Black regiments proved their worth in battle, most famously at Fort Wagner, where the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments, launched a courageous but doomed assault that became a symbol of black valor. The Confederacy, meanwhile, faced an internal crisis. Enslaved people fled by the thousands, depriving the South of labor and morale. Some slaves engaged in sabotage, in work slowdowns, in quiet resistance. The plantation economy, already strained by the war, began to collapse. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't just free slaves where Union armies advanced. It also destabilized slavery where Confederate control remained. It created uncertainty, fear, and hope. It changed the calculus of the war for everyone involved, and it made clear that there could be no compromise peace, no negotiated settlement that preserved slavery. The war would end in Union victory and slavery's destruction, or it would end in Confederate independence and slavery's continuation. Those were the only two options. The middle ground had vanished. Lincoln understood this. He understood that the Emancipation Proclamation had irrevocably changed the stakes of the war, and he embraced it. In his Gettysburg Address in November 1863, Lincoln redefined the war as a struggle for a new birth of freedom, a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure. He didn't mention slavery explicitly in that brief speech, but everyone knew what he meant. The war was about equality. It was about making real the promise of the Declaration of Independence. It was about ending the contradiction at the heart of American democracy, the coexistence of freedom and slavery. And when Lincoln was re-elected in November 1864, defeating George McClellan, who had run on a platform of negotiating peace with the Confederacy, the message was clear. The American people, or at least the Northern electorate, supported Lincoln's vision. They supported emancipation. They supported a war fought to its conclusion until slavery was dead and the Union was restored. It was a remarkable transformation. In 1861, most Northerners would have accepted a compromise that preserved slavery in the South. By 1864, they had voted for a war to destroy it. The Emancipation Proclamation had changed not just policy, but public opinion, not just law, but hearts and minds. And then the war ended. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery as a legal institution sustained by military force ceased to exist. But the question remained, what would freedom mean for the 4 million formerly enslaved people in the South? What would Reconstruction look like? What rights would Black Americans have? Would they be citizens? Would they vote? Would they own land? Would they be integrated into American society as equals, or would white supremacy find new forms, new ways to oppress and control? These questions consumed the nation in the years after Lincoln's death, and the answers tragically fell far short of the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation. Reconstruction initially offered hope. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights to black men. Black Americans were elected to Congress, to state legislatures, to local offices. They built schools, churches, businesses. They claimed their freedom and tried to build lives of dignity and opportunity. But white resistance was fierce. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations used violence and intimidation to suppress black political power. Northern commitment to Reconstruction waned as years passed. And in 1877, Reconstruction officially ended with the Compromise of 1877, which removed federal troops from the South and left black Southerners at the mercy of white supremacist governments. Jim Crow followed. Segregation, disenfranchisement, lynching, economic oppression. The promise of freedom was betrayed. But even in that betrayal, the Emancipation Proclamation mattered, because it had established a principle, a legal fact that could not be entirely erased. Slavery was illegal. That was settled. And while Jim Crow found ways to oppress black Americans, while segregation and discrimination endured for another century, the legal foundation for eventual justice had been laid. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s drew on the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation, on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, on the idea that America had committed itself legally and morally to equality. It was a long, brutal struggle. It cost lives. It required courage and sacrifice that should humble us all. But it succeeded, at least in part. Because Lincoln and the generation of the Civil War had established that slavery was incompatible with American democracy. That was the legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation. Not the full realization of freedom, but the legal and moral foundation for the ongoing struggle. So when you think about the Emancipation Proclamation, think about it as a beginning, not an ending. Think about it as Lincoln's great gamble, his belief that ending slavery was not just militarily useful but morally necessary. Think about it as the moment when America, after decades of compromise and evasion, finally confronted the original sin of slavery and took the first real step toward abolition. Think about it as a document written in the language of military necessity, but animated by a vision of human freedom. Think about it as imperfect, incomplete, but essential. And think about it as a reminder that change is possible, that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged and defeated, that individuals acting with courage and conviction can bend the arc of history toward justice. Lincoln wasn't perfect. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was the beginning of the end of slavery. And for the millions of people who gained their freedom, for the millions more who would build on that freedom in the generations to come, it was everything. On September 22, 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed a document that changed the course of American history. On January 1, 1863, that document took effect and freedom, at least in legal terms, became a reality for millions of enslaved people. The road from that moment to true equality has been long and painful and is still ongoing. But it began there in Lincoln's office with a pen and a proclamation and a belief that America could be better than it had been. That's the decision that ended slavery in America. And it's a decision we're still living with, still grappling with, still trying to fully realize more than 160 years later.